Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 22 of Circle of Fellows. This is the monthly broadcast video podcast in which four IABC Fellows gather for an hour to discuss a topic of interest to communicators. And this month's topic is communicating across cultures, which is always something of a difficult and challenging issue in the world of communications for a variety of reasons, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those. I'm Shel Holtz. I'll be moderating this session, and I am an IABC Fellow, and I have four friends with me. This is the nice thing about IABC Fellows, isn't it, is that it's like an extended family, and four of my family members are here, and I'm going to introduce them and have each of them tell you a little bit about who they are, and what their experience is in cross-cultural communication, starting with Amanda Hamilton-Attwell, who is in South Africa and deals with this on a pretty frequent basis. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Shel, and good evening to all my other fellow friends. As Shel said, I'm Amanda Hamilton-Attwell, and I am an ABC and a CPRC, and I'm, of course, a fellow. And how much do I work in cross-cultural communication? Every day. If you're in South Africa, with 11 official languages, cross-cultural communication is part of everyday life.
Terrific. And next up, Angela Sinickas, now in Southern California.
Which is why it was hard to find a background that didn't have boxes in it or reconstruction going on.
Just moved in.
Just moved in last night. So in my day job, I am a communication research and measurement consultant. I have my own agency for the last 17 years. But in terms of cross-cultural communication, I do a lot of work internationally. So I've always had an interest in this. My parents were born in Europe, so I was kind of raised like a European more than an American. But I got my master's in leadership a few years ago. And so for my final project, I combined what I learned about leadership, things like storytelling, transformational leadership, emotional intelligence, all those academic courses, with what I know about communication and my experiences with cross-cultural communication and some wonderful books. And that was my master's thesis is, for example, if you have a CEO from one very strong culture and he's going to be doing an employee town hall in another one, what kinds of things should we as communicators be coaching them on to do differently than they would in their own home country?
So you've got a lot of recent knowledge stored up about this.
A bit.
Next up is our newest fellow, inducted in the class of 2017 at the IABC World Conference in Washington, D.C., which just wrapped up yesterday. So if some of us look a little bleary-eyed, we got home on very late flights. But Brenda Siler, who interestingly and appropriately was honored with the induction to the fellows in her hometown, and that doesn't happen very often, but it was great to see that, Brenda, and it was great to see you. So introduce yourself and give us a little background on your cross-cultural experience.
Hello, everyone. And coming to you right in the metro area of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital of the United States. And it's a pleasure to be with you today. I bring to you a career that spans a little more than 40 years, and I'm what you might call your classic communications generalist. I've done the media relations, I've done the events, I've done executive communications, I've done publications. And in those areas, those disciplines, the way that I have looked at communicating across cultures is beyond what I think is the obvious, which is reaching out to ethnic groups. I've done 2 stints in my career at AARP, which is the Membership Association for people in the United States who are age 50 and older. So I have operated quite a bit through the lens of how do you communicate effectively with older people. And then since I've lived in large metropolitan areas, I have looked at how do you communicate when your area of communication crosses state lines and when they cross a number of what we have here in the United States, county lines. So how do I reach those people as well? So I look forward to today's discussion about cross-cultural communications.
Looking forward to it too, Brenda. Thanks. And finally, Ned Lundquist, who is also in the DC area.
Thanks, Shel. I'm Ned Lundquist, ABC, and I am an IABC Fellow. And I enjoyed being with Brenda, Shel, and Angela this week. And sorry that Amanda couldn't have been with us. It was a great conference. I'm a retired naval officer and have been working in corporate communications and as a government contractor. I still work for a contractor, a company called MCR, where I'm a science writer. And I'm also, I have my own company, Echo Bridge, and I'm a writer, and I look for ways to do outreach and advocacy for my clients. Cross-cultural communication is something that everyone has to engage with and embrace, because we don't communicate directly with only one audience. We're communicating with multiple audiences in multiple ways, and understanding how that communication affects those different audiences is very important. Whether you're communicating internally to different audiences or externally to a broad group of stakeholders. So I think this is going to be very interesting for me, and I'm looking forward to hearing what my fellows are going to be talking about.
And you raise a good point, Ned, which I think will be the first question I toss out to you. But first, I want to let everybody watching live know that we would like to answer your questions. So if you have one, go to Twitter and send us your question using the hashtag COF22. That's for Circle of Fellows episode 22. So hashtag COF22. I'm monitoring that, and we'll pass your questions along to the panel. But Ned, you raised the notion that we're communicating to a lot of audiences, and for a lot of organizations, they don't have the budget or the resources to create separate communications for different cultures. They're sort of stuck with a one-size-fits-all communication model or platform. So how do you ensure that the message that you're delivering will be acceptable and understandable and not offensive across all of those cultures? And anybody can take a stab at this.
Sounds like Amanda's dog wants to take a part in this one.
First of all, there is no one answer to that. I think it requires the communicator and leadership, if the communicator is working with leadership to help communicate for an organization, to be culturally sensitive and aware of the different segments of the group of stakeholders that are being communicated with. And that goes beyond just a cultural sensitivity, but also understanding what are the effective pathways of reaching those audiences, and also having ways to ensure, have that two-way pathway to be able to ensure that those people you're communicating with, that you have reached them and it's been effective. And so that goes beyond just understanding the audience, but also understanding the ways and means that you're communicating with them.
And I would say that you really need to research your audience before you start even crafting the message. You need to find out how your audience likes to receive information. For example, when I talked about having worked at AARP, and we have older people of varying age groupings above the age of 50, there are a lot of older people who are not online. And one of the challenges we had at AARP is that most of their materials, their webinars, their way of delivering information is an online version. So what do you do with those older people who are not online, are not comfortable online, don't have access to being online? So you need to make, and that is offensive. It is another way of offending an individual when you're not considering how they can receive information. So we had to really work hard to make sure that we were using a number of different delivery methods to get our messages across.
Shel, you mentioned that the cost of different media, different messages. And in South Africa, we definitely experienced that, because previously messages would have been translated in several languages to make it accessible. You know, I work a lot in the mining industry, but we don't have that luxury anymore. And what we found works best is that the line manager is still a core component in the communication network. So if the line manager knows the culture, the societal culture as well as the personal culture of the team members, and giving him the written copy, and then he translating that to his group, works much better than trying to have a message specific to the culture of the team, because that can comprise several cultures in South Africa.
So that requires that there be a level of communication that is focused on the manager or the line manager, in addition to a broader communication that is aimed at everybody, more the mass media distribution, Amanda? Or do you rely entirely on that line manager in those circumstances?
Shel, it is that you do one and you don't leave the other. So there will be the general messages, there will be the newsletter, there will be the plasma screens, but for specific messages, key messages, we will depend a lot on the line manager, but the mass media in organizational sense, that will be probably prepared for the common denominator, for the biggest group of people, in a language, in a style that most of the people will be able to understand the English. But the line manager might, from time to time, because a lot of them can speak ethnic languages, will translate it from English into the ethnic language.
But it goes beyond being able to translate something. Sometimes it also, for example, I was at a conference that involved West African countries, and the conference was in both English and French. You had a translation, but the French countries did not want to hear English. They wanted it translated, and some of the people that were presenting, when the translation equipment broke, they didn't want to speak English, even though they could, because they felt that it was more appropriate that they speak French, even though they could speak English perfectly. I worked with a communicator who was doing communication for a client that was supposed to cover Europe, and they wanted him to do some multilingual products, and he said, no, you can't do something in English and French and deliver that in France and England. You have to do it only in French in France and only in English in the UK, because people would reject it otherwise, wouldn't look at something that had the other language as part of that product.
And it's not only the rejection or the social acceptability of it. With one of my recent clients, they are in about 24 different countries. And one of the things we measured on their survey was how well people understand strategy, news of what's going on, a variety of subjects. And one thing we correlated with that was in which language the company magazine was made available. And if it was made available in their home language, which could be English in many countries, they were about 20 or more than 20 percentage points better informed on those topics than people for whom it was not translated. So yes, it is a cost to do translation, but if people aren't getting those messages to help you make money or save money, that's really not the right way to look at budgets.
And the way to research that in terms of language, and even within a language, dialects within a language, for example, in the Latino community here in the Washington, D.C. area, the predominant country represented are from El Salvador. And then you have those who are Mexican, and then you have those who are Puerto Rican. Before you even start delivering your messages, you need to go out and spend some time interacting with those audience to figure out, how do you want to receive the information most important to you, so that when you are targeting your messages, you're making sure that you are zoning in on exactly the audience you want to communicate with. This is a challenge that I also had with AARP when I was in Atlanta, there was this perception that there is some sort of generic Spanish that will work with all dialects. And I had to find a company that would translate medical information, because for the medical industry, for the healthcare industry, there is a form of Spanish that is almost 80 to 90% doable in terms of communicating across Spanish dialects. So again, it's knowing your audiences and doing your research to make sure that you are putting together the information in the proper way.
But we all know as communicators that language, words, are only a small part of communication. So I recently read an interesting article by Munter, and he talks about high context cultures and low context cultures, and the difference in how they interpret communication just by the non-verbals in the communication. So, you know, despite the fact that we can speak the language, we must also speak the body, the gestures, and I think that might even be more difficult than just speaking the words of the language.
And the context goes beyond just the body language as well. It's how much and what kinds of information you provide for people.
Yeah.
Because for example, in the United States, we're fairly low context. We just take the words and management might tell us to go do something, and we're expected to go do it. But in many more high context cultures, they're going to want to know more of the background of the situation. They're going to want to know the options you considered. They want to know the repercussions. And so if you've got someone from a low context country speaking to people in a high context country, they're not going to understand what you're talking about. But vice versa, you get an executive from a high context country coming to speak to people with low context. They're going to think, won't this guy ever shut up? Because all he does is talk, just get to the point and move on. So that's another kind of context that's involved.
Yeah.
It also translates over into business communication. When I was doing work in Puerto Rico, the letters, business letters that were going out to U.S. countries and also going to Puerto Rico, it was felt that the way that we communicate in business letters here in the United States is very harsh, direct, can be standoffish. You know, people just don't get that. When it would go to Puerto Rico, they received that as being very negative. And so I asked our volunteers in Puerto Rico, I said, tell me what it is that would allow you to receive our information better. And it had to do with putting more words like please and thank you in your writing. You know, if you don't mind, if you are so willing to, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. That's not the way we do business letters here in the United States when we're interfacing with one another.
One of the important things to keep in mind when it doesn't even have to be an international situation. It could be, you know, as Brenda said, you have different cultures right there in your hometown. But we could have, an organization could have the permission, the legal authority, all the permits, all the documentation to be able to do something in a community. But if the community doesn't allow it because they don't understand it and you haven't communicated effectively with that community, you don't have what I've heard referred to as social license. I first heard about this in Nanaimo, British Columbia, where the local harbor master had to deal with a number of different communities, including First Nations, or what we in the U.S. might refer to as Native Americans. Up there, they refer to them as the First Nation. And if you don't have that tacit approval because you properly communicated with them and they understand why you want to do something, even if you have the permission or the authority and the law on your side, it's not going to happen because the community doesn't grant you the license to do it. So this social understanding, in order to be able to have that license is so important.
What are the methods that you use to find out what those cultural cues are, what's acceptable and what isn't? I mean, you know, I understand asking on the ground, especially if you're doing internal communications. You can go to people who are in the countries where you're working. I've done this many times in my career, but with external communications where you're going to be marketing to 20, 30, 40 countries everywhere where your organization does business, what kind of resources are you accustomed to using to find out how you have to either genericize everything to the point that you remove anything that's offensive, or craft separate communications that are appropriate to each of the cultures where you're delivering those messages?
If someone's looking for a book, I obviously had to read a lot of books for my master's project, but the one that I found most useful for people in business and business communicators is a book called Managing Across Cultures by Charlene Solomon, because it's very practical. And it also includes an assessment tool. And because I'm into measurement, I love assessment. So what she and her co-author have done is there's like a 26 question questionnaire that covers 7 different cultural scales. And so for each individual, like a supervisor or an executive who's going to be doing some communicating, or in this case, the marketing person, you first figure out where you are on each of these norms, because that's where your biases are going to show up. And then you look at, let's say, a particular country where you're going to be communicating, and look at where they fall on those 7 scales. And if you're in a similar place, well, then that's good. But if you're at some opposite extreme, that's where you need to start taking it into account. And the other thing this book does is for 50 major countries, it shows where each of them on average fall on each of those 7 scales. So as a handy dandy guide, I just found that very useful.
What was her name again? Charlene what?
Solomon.
Solomon.
Yes, now on my reading list.
IABC Network. This is where it is important for you to be active in a professional association. And since we are a global association, I can call or reach out to or email an IABC member in another state. And even when I was working in doing work in Puerto Rico, when I did a number of activities in Puerto Rico, I got in touch with a friend of mine in Atlanta who worked in communications at AT&T. Her southern region territory included Puerto Rico. Touch with her communications staff in Puerto Rico. And I just sucked every bit of information about how to work with the media there. They gave me all the media contacts I needed. I asked them about my press information I was putting out. They graciously agreed to review it for me. And because I was working in an association and didn't have a budget, and they were AT&T and had a lot of money, they needed to show that they were good corporate citizens. So they were happy to help me out. And even in the United States, when I'm going to drill down to various communities within a state, different cities, I got in touch with IABC members, for example, in how you communicate in Southern Florida is different than in middle part of Georgia, Orlando, Tampa area, and it's different when you're coming up to the Jacksonville area. So thank God for the IABC network that helped me figure out who were the right folks to contact in the media. Were there some other community groups out to as another way of getting the information out? Maybe I could do a flyer and make it available to various community groups that could help, again, disseminate the information that I wanted to get out.
Yeah, I'll echo that. My experience was also Puerto Rico, Brenda. When I was with Allergan in the communications department, we had an issue arise in Puerto Rico that had the president and the chief communications officer / investor relations VP fly out there. I went too, but in advance, I wanted somebody on the ground who knew what the culture was. I just went to the IABC directory and found somebody and called, and when I asked for help for an Allergan project, she said, "I'm sorry, we're way too busy. We're overbooked. We can't help right now." And I said, "Oh, that's too bad. I found you in the IABC directory." And she said, "Oh, you're IABC?" And it suddenly dropped everything. But one of the things she pointed out is that dealing with the press in Puerto Rico is different than it is on the mainland. The expectations of reporters are different, and how you get them to pay attention, and how you pitch them, and that is a cultural difference. And it was really important that we had her on the ground helping us out with that. So, getting a local resource, if you're doing those kind of real-time communications, can be a real godsend.
Well, and pre-testing what you're planning on using is a really good way to avoid problems. We were doing focus groups for an all-employee publication that went into many different countries. And in the focus groups, one of the things we talked about was their magazine, and we brought with us a copy of the most recent issue. And so the photos got all kinds of different reactions in different countries. So in one country, in Germany, we had a picture in there of their company CEO at some kind of company golf tournament wearing an open net golf shirt. And they were so upset that we would be so disrespectful of his position, because they're a very hierarchical society, that was not the kind of appropriate show. Part of our culture. Well, the winery client, and even still, it was offensive. But my funniest one that I'll never forget was in France, when we were doing the focus groups. One gentleman said, I was in one of those photos a few issues ago, and they sent out an American photographer to take this group picture, and they would not stop taking pictures until they had us all grinning like crazy Americans. And then when the picture came out, all of my friends were teasing me, like, what happened to me? So these are things that we wouldn't normally think of, but if you pre-test them before like a big marketing campaign, you can avoid those problems.
Yeah. And Shel, I know also that in in Africa, what would be regarded as a bribery in one country with regard to getting news in a newspaper would be common practice. In another one, in another country, it will be, this is the way we do business, and it's not bribery in their context. So I think even values, and what we see as proper, as Angela said, in one country will be totally. And if I recently was involved in a values program for a big global company, and I looked at some of the case studies, and I thought, it is so European that, and I questioned if it was really appropriate in all the countries where because values differ from country to country.
Yeah, I want to just take a second to remind everybody who's watching live that you can send us questions via Twitter using the hashtag COF22, and I'll get those and pass those along to the panel. Yeah, even brand names can be an issue. I remember the case study of Chevrolet, which used to have a car called the Chevy Nova, and they introduced that into South America, where Nova translated into doesn't go.
Oh, go.
Just became the...
Well, another one of my... Oh, go ahead.
I think it was a young child who brought that to Chevrolet's attention too.
Well, my favorite one in that same context is in the United States, we had this Dairy Council campaign for many years called Got Milk. And it shows a glass of milk, and the celebrity has a white mustache over their lips. Well, when they someone just simply translated 2 words into Spanish, which is "tienes leche." The only problem is that what that means is, are you lactating?
Yeah, that's important to test. And Angela, I know that you'll appreciate this, but in my days working in human resources consulting firms, you can send benefits enrollment materials that are going to employees to a translator. And, if they don't understand the technical language, they'll do fine with everything except stuff like co-payment and co-insurance and deductible, because they have very specific language around that. But if you're just doing a general translation, somebody who doesn't know that technical language will use other words, and it just makes it confusing to the employees.
Or on surveys. So, for example, on a scale, you might have a scale to excellent, to good, to fair, to poor. And I've seen, luckily, I know I'm a little bit of a mongrel of languages, and I know a little bit about several of them. And I noticed that somebody had translated fair as in, so into just, like justice, fairness. It's like, how would people answer that on a survey?
Right.
Let me throw another type of cultural issue at you, and I want to talk for a little bit about employee communications and reaching employees. Years ago, I read this wonderful book. I wish I could remember the name of the author, but it was called Beyond Race and Gender. Dealt with communication, and the author suggested that one form of diversity that people don't think about is inside an organization. If you are a large corporation, for example, and everybody wears a shirt and a tie, and dresses well. I worked for a company where if you stepped outside your office or your cube, you were supposed to put your coat on lest a client see you in your shirt sleeves.
I worked.
But what if you acquire a smaller company that has a sleeves rolled up type of culture? Is it your job to assimilate them? How do you communicate when you've been accustomed to communicating to people who are part of this button down culture, but it now includes a group of employees who are much less formal and more accustomed to being casual in their approach, not only to how they dress, but how they behave at work?
Well, it might depend on your objectives for the merger, because sometimes you buy a company because what it's doing is so different from what you do, and you want to retain that because they've got a particular market niche. If you try to make them look like yourselves, it's not going to work. On the other hand, I worked at a company where they acquired 4 different companies, and we did want to have some kind of similarity that we did more through mission, vision, and values and making it practical. So you really figure out what are your business objectives, I think, and then match what you do next to that.
But Shel raises a good point about what is diversity. I was getting ready to brief the marketing and communications committee of a big organization, and they showed me, and these were cooperatives from all over the country. And I looked at the committee, and they were all older white men. And I said, this doesn't look like a very diverse group. And the guy says, oh, no, this is really diverse. Now, here's your chairman here. He's from Wisconsin. He's in dairy. Now, you got your guy here from Iowa. He's in corn. Now, the guy in Missouri, he's got cattle. And then we got this guy who's doing wheat. And we got this other fellow, and he's doing soybeans. So we're very, very diverse. And he was right from that perspective.
Well, just a real quick example, we were doing some focus groups with a client, and we were talking about diversity, but one type of diversity that they brought up that never usually comes up is educational diversity. And the point they brought up is our policy manual says that to be promoted to supervisor or manager, you have to have either a college degree or 10 years working here. They said, but look around. I challenge you to find anyone in management who does not have a college degree.
I have to tell you about this article. This is fairly recent. This was June 9th in the Observer, and the headline just made me have one of those facepalm moments. It's all-male PR panel. Let's see if I can bring this up again. All-male PR panel tells women they can fix sexism by speaking up more loudly. I just thought that was terrific, and I was a little surprised to see Richard Edelman cited here, that he was one of the folks who was out there saying that he recalled that he asked women on his executive team why they didn't talk during meetings, and they said because of the room's macho culture. He said, I asked them, how are we going to fix that? Either you're going to speak up or I'm going to have to hammer the guys. Edelman said, they said hammer the guys first, and I said you speak up first. I mean, I'd like to know what you think of this approach. Well, first of all, an all-white panel talking about women making advances in PR has issues of its own.
Well, that speaks to what's happening in business in terms of who is in leadership, who represents leadership in organizations. One of the things that I've been fortunate to be a part of, working in large associations and nonprofits, is to have an advisory group, people from outside the organization that can come in, and then I invite senior management to sit in on our committee. And colleagues in my department, in the communications department, made sure that our advisory group, made up of external folks, were diverse. And senior management, which was a predominantly Caucasian group, could see where there are senior communicators, knowledgeable, accomplished individuals that could quickly understand some of the things that we were trying to tackle through our communication strategies and advise me. And it never failed that after those meetings were over and you could hear from a diverse group of women, different ethnicity, males, that my Caucasian CEO and executive director would come up to me after the meeting and say, that was really great. How do you know those people? Where did they come from? You know, that what they said was just right on point and everything. And I would tell them, you know, well, these are the people I interface with. I met a lot of them through IABC. And I think when you're bringing in external voices, you need to, you know, work with your colleagues to make sure that you are identifying a diverse group of external voices to help advise you. And not just keep it in-house. Don't keep it close to the family. You got to step out.
Yeah, Brenda, I was going to ask about your experience at AARP because, first of all, I should freely admit I'm a member. And yeah, the culture that I think all the members of AARP share in common is that senior status. But beyond that, it crosses so many different cultures. Yeah, so you're sending out the AARP magazine to a bunch of people who have their age in common, although it's a broad range of senior ages. But you're going to different parts of the country. You're going to different ethnicities. How did you approach that at AARP?
When I worked at AARP, my area in this recent stint at AARP from 2013 to 2016, my focus was on Washington, D.C. And when I say Washington, D.C., I mean exactly that. Not suburban Maryland or suburban Virginia. People may understand that Washington, D.C. is considered including the metro area, Maryland and Virginia, but my focus was strictly inside the city limits of Washington, D.C. So yes, we were dealing with older people, but even when you get into people who are over the age of 50, the membership starts at age 50, even more. You know, you have 50 to maybe 68. Those individuals may have recently transitioned out of full-time work. They're more adept at email and being online. And then you're looking at folks that are 70 plus and prefer to read a paper. They're not going to get their news from online. So as I said earlier, how do you get to those folks? And then we did outreach with the LGBTQ community in Washington, D.C. We were very much involved with working with older members who were LGBTQ, a lot with some of the various ally groups and other groups that reached out to the LGBTQ community, lots of media working that we could send information out to. And then again, you're talking about older Latinos, older Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders. Around the corner from our office is Chinatown from the AARP office, and there is a community center where older Asian Americans, many of whom do not speak English very well, so it's their children that are translating for them, or maybe someone at the community center, how we work with them. The biggest challenge for reaching out to older Asians is that there's difficulty in them finding places where they can shop and get the foods that they like. So we knew that one way to get information out to them, that group, is to, one, work with the community leaders who were bilingual, and they would have to be bused to get their groceries. And there's a lot of chatter and interaction that you can do when riding a bus for 30 minutes to get your groceries. So, to make sure that we had information that could be articulated during those bus rides. So there were, and then of course you have the Black community, and I prefer to say Black in terms of the DC area versus African American, because you have some Black individuals who are from the Caribbean, you have Black Latinos, we have a lot of Africans here in the area, so you can't always say African American, people that are here in the United States. So again, within a culture, you gotta go down a couple of layers. You gotta break it down. And there are radio programs for the Caribbean community. There are newspapers for the Caribbean, radio programs for the African community. You have Black newspapers, the National Association Publishers, which is the Association for Black-owned newspapers in the United States, is headquartered here in the DC area. So there's a lot of ways, as I was saying earlier, you've got to break down all those communities. It's a great turn to help you get to know what all those groups are.
Amanda, we've lost your video, but I think you're still there. Is this the same type of approach you would take in South Africa?
Yes, it is exactly what we will do in South Africa. And, it's also interesting. I find this, any conversation about cross-cultural communication, intercultural communication, very interesting, because I feel that, eventually, in communication, you need to know your stakeholders, you need to know your target group. And is cross-cultural communication in that sense any different from ordinary communication? Because you are supposed to know your target audience. So if I go to Puerto Rico and I communicate there, I need to know my stakeholders. If I go to Shoshongove in Pretoria, I need to know my stakeholders. If I go to, Montana next door, not Montana, America, Montana in Pretoria, I need to know my stakeholders. So is it any different? Is cross-cultural communication any different from
I think one difference
communication, because the principle stays the same. You need to know your target group.
I think the issue comes, though, is that sometimes you don't know the right questions to ask because of your own built-in biases, that you don't even know what you should be finding out about those audiences.
So
and that's where books or something like that have been very helpful, because it sort of highlights, for example, Shel, you and I have spoken in Brazil as part of a training course there. And I remember the first couple of times I was there, I was always a little bit offended when people in the class would start talking to each other. And because you wouldn't do that in the US, that especially that you could be heard by other people. But it's more of a social thing there. And they're not just chatting about what they're going to do for lunch. They're actually talking about what I just said. And nobody around them was being bothered by it. I was the only one. So the very first time I sort of paused and said nothing for a while until there was silence in the room, like a teacher, right, in America. And then I began to understand what was going on. And I just learned to adapt because I was there for them. They weren't there for me.
Ned, I wonder if your experience in the Navy has anything that is useful for communicators. I know that ships tie up at ports in other countries, and the naval personnel get off the ship and go interact with the locals, and we have bases in other countries, and I'm sure they train people how to treat people respectfully, say in Japan. So what lessons come out of that experience that would translate into something communicators could use?
Well, it's obvious that you have to brief your crews before you pull into a port. Everything from what the money is and what the exchange rate is to forms of polite forms of address and places to stay out of. There's a lot of things you do to before you send the crew out on liberty. The Navy always feels that the best the best ambassador for the United States is an American sailor, because he or she truly represents the nation. So you definitely have to give them some of those pointers, but you can't really make someone totally culturally sensitive in a 1 hour brief before they go ashore. I think there's some great examples of the teams that have been trained to go into places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where you're doing reconstruction and rebuilding a society, rebuilding from the infrastructure to the things that deliver social services, and try to get that society back on its feet, especially after you've been a part of whatever caused a lot of that infrastructure to come apart. This is it's not something that you can fix overnight. There's a lot of research that's gone into the narrative that you share with these societies and these cultural groups, so that they don't pull apart that which you're trying to help them put back together. There's a lot of nuances. There's a lot of research that goes into that. There's a lot of sampling that goes into it. I don't even begin to understand, because I haven't been in Afghanistan. I've been to Iraq, but not involved with that kind of social reintegration of a society. But I think it's every base you go to, there's a great effort to become part of that community, to get people to. A lot of times people live off the base. I was talking to the commanding officer of the newest base in the Navy, which is in Poland, where we're building a ballistic missile defense site. And he said, we get out as much as we can. We love to go out. They're very fond of us when we go out there. We like to go out and eat in different restaurants. And he said, sometimes their English isn't so good. Usually my Polish isn't so good. He said, you have to learn how to order anything you want on the menu, but eat whatever ends up on your plate.
Because you don't want to go, ew.
I didn't order that. Yes, you did.
nor would I have. Angela, I know you spent a lot of time in Lithuania, which is part of your heritage. And I know you go there not just for work, but for personal reasons. But do you take any lessons out of your relationship with the land of your ancestors?
It's interesting because there's certain parts of Lithuanian culture I actually grew up with, because with the diaspora, actually I just met another Lithuanian Australian at the IABC conference who won a gold quill. And she and I had very similar experiences growing up, is that every weekend all we did was Lithuanian things, Lithuanian school, Lithuanian scouts, Lithuanian folk dancing. And so we were in what was the Lithuanian culture before World War II. And so, of course, Lithuania continued on as a growing culture after that point. And one thing that I noticed because of Soviet occupation is people might not be as open for sharing ideas as like the people that I grew up with who left before the Soviets sent people to Siberia. And this carries over into business as well. You won't get it if you're having a discussion, you won't get as many people sharing ideas until they have a comfort that there's other people thinking like them and they're not going to be taken away to Siberia, even though it's been 25 years. But there's also another thing is just even sometimes the words they end up using. So when I grew up saying goodbye as sudio, which is a little bit like adios, meaning with God. But because the Soviets didn't believe in religion, that was not the way you could say goodbye anymore. And now instead it's until I see you again, which is a long phrase. And so they just reduced it to until. The cultures keep changing. Even when you think you've got a handle on it, there are things that can completely change slowly, but to a very different degree than what you would have expected it to be.
We've been talking about various techniques for communicating across cultures. Let's take a few minutes as this winds down to talk about what you do when you screw up your communication across culture. You've done something that is culturally offensive. you've used wrong language and confused people, but at the end of the day, what you've done is lost credibility and trust in that culture. So what are your steps to fixing that?
Apologize.
Yeah, apologize.
Genuinely.
Yeah.
Apologize, and also if you're reaching out to a broad audience, you need to not only apologize, but go to whoever is your point of contact within that particular community or within that culture. You know, you may have one or two people that you have grown to be friends with, and you go to them and ask them after you have apologized, how can I rectify this? How can I make this up? And allow them to guide you, navigate you through a process, and help you to mend fences if it is such an offense that you have gotten yourself into.
Well, and if possible, if you're going to be repeating, let's say you've done something wrong during something like a town hall meeting, at the very next town hall meeting, you make a very strong point of doing it exactly the right way, and maybe even calling attention to it again at that point. Saying, you know, I'm sorry, I screwed up the last time. I've learned something, and now we're, you know, going to do it in a different way.
And that sincerity can actually come out as a positive, and insincerity will dig you way deeper into a hole.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And the
My experience.
Go ahead, Amanda.
My experience is that if you apologize and you indicate to the people that you try your best to understand their culture, they accept your apologies as long as, you know, it is sincere, as it was said.
Yeah, I remember a case study. In fact, I think I saw this at an IABC conference many years ago, and I wish I could remember the details, but it was a company that marketed a product into a Muslim majority country, and the product contained ingredients that were absolutely forbidden under, you know, halal. So they had to do this not as an individual who made a mistake, but as a whole company that made a mistake. And as I recall, the communication that they undertook in order to regain trust was greater than the communication that they did to introduce the product in the first place.
Well, that's inexcusable for a company to make that kind of a mistake.
In the first place.
Yeah.
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 They didn't do their market research.
I mean, that's a total, that's probably ignorance topped only by arrogance.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
Of that, I remember reading in history that when the British were still colonizing India, the bullets that people were supposed to be using had somehow been packed or done something with pig grease. And that's, again, it's not kosher, not that that's not the right word for India, but and people refused and were shot for
Yep. Well, we're getting close to the end of our hour together. What I'd like to do is go around the room and have some final thoughts from you. Your best piece of advice for somebody who's embarking on communication that will reach across multiple cultures. Just the one thing that you would like them to walk away from this with, and we'll go backwards across the thumbnails at the bottom of my screen, which puts you on the spot first, Ned.
Well, thanks, Shel, and thanks for helping to bring this all together, and thanks also to Anna Willie for helping to put this together. I'm sure she's out there listening. It's one of the most important tenets of organizational communication to know your audience, and it's also important to try to understand that which you don't know. So if you don't think you know your audience, then do your research, do your homework, enlist some help from someone who is more familiar with that terrain, and do your best to understand it so that when you do communicate, even if you make a mistake, an attempt that's sincere goes over a lot more than something that might be overbearing and arrogant. That doesn't work.
Great. Brenda?
Yes, when you're exploring your audiences and researching your audiences and you're going local, understand the difference between jurisdictions, municipalities, local jurisdictions and municipalities. For example, here in Washington, D.C., we're divided into 4 quadrants: Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, Southwest. If I'm doing something in Southwest, then I wouldn't promote it in Northeast. So, I mean, you have to drill down. When I lived in Atlanta, it was a 10-county metro area. I would not promote something in Douglas County in another county that's far away on the other side. So, again, when you're thinking about cultural differences, just think about locally, even communities, and how you need to identify media outlets in the community that you really want to hit home with.
Great. Angela?
I would just say, if you are in a situation where you work with CEOs of your company or high leaders, and they do go frequently to other countries, or if you send executives raised in one culture to then go manage another country for a while, please send me an email. I'd be happy to send you the guide that I put together to help them understand their own biases and exactly how to change what they're doing for that particular culture. It's based country to country. So just Angela@sinicom.com, SINICOM.com. And that way, that saves me talking about 28 pages worth of a final thought.
And Amanda?
I would like to say to somebody who needs to venture out in a different culture, remember it is enriching. Remember it is multi-layered. It is like an onion. The first layers are easy. The core is the difficult part because you cannot see it. And then do your homework and have fun. It is fun to learn about a new culture.
Yes.
It is. And I would say something we didn't talk much about is to find out who the influencers are in that culture. I judged a communication entry. The challenge was to, they found that the population of Black men in the Baltimore area weren't going in and getting prostate exams. And they wanted to get that message out, and they did it through barbershops, working with barbers to spread that message. And man, that worked really well. So knowing where the lines of communication are can be really valuable. And rather than talking to them directly, convince the influencers to start spreading the word. I want to thank you all. Also, I want to echo what Ned said. Anna Willie, we could not pull this off without Anna's hard work and diligence in putting the panels together and reminding everybody of when to be online. And Anna wanted to make sure that I let you all know that next month we will be doing the Circle of Fellows on July 20th at the same time, noon Eastern, on becoming a strategic advisor in organizations. John Gersner, Jim Lukaszewski, Jim Schaefer, and Mark Schumann will be on that panel, an all-male panel. but we won't tell women how to get ahead and become a strategic advisor, I swear. So that'll be coming up on July 20th. Until then, thanks, everybody. It was great seeing 3 of the 4 of you in Washington this past week. I can't wait until we're all together again. And until next month, that's it for this episode of Circle of Fellows.